So we're talking about this again. But as we said just yesterday, what happened? The fact that you had someone prepared to brief a very, very much, Tory paper that, oh, yes, we're considering a Swiss style deal, speaks volumes of where potentially Sunak might be going. Now, this may have been maybe interpreted wrongly by the figure who said this. Maybe they were, mistaken to say, oh, we want a Swiss style deal, but Rishi Sunak might be prepared to do, shall we say, cut some deals with the EU to remove some barriers. It not being, shall we say, a full style sort of Swiss agreement, but at least maybe be willing to reopen the negotiations about the withdrawal agreement and the deal that Johnson did. It's possible. And as we've said, there has been some very, very good mood music coming out about the Northern Ireland protocols, meaning that they are progressing. And even the ERG is worried by how well that is going, which should worry us quite a bit, to be honest, because as we've seen when we've talked about what's been going on in Northern Ireland, the consequences for this going wrong are potentially going to be very, very bad for the people over there. But we now have a situation where the Tories, on Brexiteers of all stripes, from the hardcore to the lights, are now worried about the fact that their Prime Minister may very well be a Brexit heretic or about to commit a massive form of heresy. Because certainly during the Johnson years, it was said by the Brexiteers to Boris that any form of capitulation would be seen as a betrayal of Brexit. So could Rishi Sunak be about to basically do a very, very much common sense deal with the EU, only for the Brexiteers to turn around and say, oh no, Rishi Sunak has betrayed Brexit. And as a result, could just get rid of him. So today we're going to go over this because this is even more interesting because the guy who wrote this is called Henry Hill. And he is the deputy editor of Conservative Home. As I've said before, I've been reading that more and more. Interestingly, certainly since the Conservative leadership contest, partly because of just the general hilarity that you get. Just today, there was an MP who wrote an article for Conservative Home coming to the mind-blowing conclusion that if we offer young people things, maybe they would vote for the Conservatives. It's just... yeah, oh boy. And that's just a recent one I can think of. But, oh boy. But anyway, we're going to go over this because I think this offers some even more interesting insights into what is going on and offers even more insight into this incredible Mexican standoff that we've got going on, because we've got a situation where the Conservative Party does not know what to do beyond the budget, and everyone's got their guns out. Everyone's sort of, facing each other, and everyone is too terrified to even blink, take a breath, or even turn away to see what else is going on for fear of being shot. That is the state that the Conservative Party is in, and it's absolutely fascinating to watch. I can tell you that now. But anyway, we'll go diving into this. But before we do that, please remember to hit that like, share, and subscribe button. And of course, down below, there are links to my Patreon page and a one-off link called Buy Me Coffee, where you can buy me coffee. And as always, thank you very much to all those people who do help watch and support the channel. So over we go to The Guardian. Like I say, with Henry Hill's piece on this of here's why Tories are raging again over Brexit. They really don't trust Rishi Sunak. That's highly interesting. So, It is objectively quite absurd for the Conservative Party to have spent the weekend having a row over whether or not the United Kingdom is moving towards a Swiss-style relationship with the European Union. For starters, Brussels doesn't particularly like the morass of bilateral treaties it has with Bern, and there is no evidence that a similar agreement would be made available to London even if we wanted one, which the government insists it does not. But there's nothing stopping, like I say, us revisiting the withdrawal agreement to helping to sort of re-lower some of the barriers that are being created. There's nothing stopping us aligning on many of these regulations, because many of these regulations we ultimately vastly agree with in Parliament. You know, all these sort of rules and regulations, when they were brought into Parliament to be voted on, were always sort of very much passed with very large majorities, except with, the occasional, couple of anti-ERGers that were voting against them. So regulations by and large are very, very popular. So it would not be on the realms of possibility of doing, some alignment deals here on this. It's not beyond the realms of possibility. And that is why it might have been, whoever briefed the press misused the term the Swiss style deal to describe potentially what Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt want to do, because they've already said it. They want to lower these trade barriers between the UK and the EU. And if they want to do that, then they will essentially look at doing some bilateral deals. It probably won't be a full Swiss style deal, but it will be sort of like it. So back to it. Nope. There we go. Secondly, because despite possessing on paper a large majority, so fractious is the parliamentary Tory party at present that Rishi Sunak must govern as if he had a much smaller one, or none at all. And in those circumstances, a significant renegotiation of our deal with the EU is simply not possible. I disagree with that. I fundamentally disagree with that assertion, because how many Tories would be willing, just like Rishi Sunak, to relook at the economic reality and go, we have to repair our economic relationship with the EU. We need that relationship if we are to achieve growth, if we are to even at least maybe salvage our economy in some way, shape, or form within the next 2 years. We have to repair that. So I fundamentally disagree, but it's just a question of how many Tory MPs are at that stage. And at the moment, we really don't know. So back to it. Thirdly, whoever kicked off the row by speaking to the Sunday Times was talking more about removing the trade barriers over the next 10 years or so. And unless the Prime Minister proves a true political miracle worker, the Conservatives won't be in government for more than 2. Which is what we said at the beginning, that maybe this was, misspoken by whoever spoke to the Sunday Times on that. So beyond those hard realities, it is also just bad politics. The next 2 years are going to be extremely difficult as is, and voters are going to expect ministers to be ruthlessly focused on the cost of living crisis and other bread and butter issues. If the Tories instead spend their entire time are engaging in arcane disputes about the technical details of our relationship with the EU, it will send entirely the wrong signal to where the party's priorities really lie. And we've seen that at the moment. You look at focus groups, you look at polls. People want the government to be focusing on the cost of living crisis and on the energy crisis, and especially sorting out the economy. Those are the 3 top priorities that we see from focus groups, we see from polling. So that's very much right. If they do spend that or any argument fighting over that, it will be seen as a very bad political move. This doesn't mean those details aren't important. They are. We spent the whole of last Parliament fighting over them for a reason. But Boris Johnson's secured his historic win in the 2019 election with a promise to get Brexit done. That meant not only getting us out, but also allowing politicians to start focusing on other issues. If the Conservatives expect to reach the next election with precious little to show for levelling up, which they indeed will have very precious little to show, and the argument still over the terms for our dispute over 5 years after the voters gave them a majority to sort it out, it's of little surprise that the relatively young MPs are already announcing their plans to step down. And those are two important things. So, first, well, actually, there's three important things. First of all, they are right. At the next election, levelling up, the fact that you've got Rishi Sunak there with that video saying how he gladly took money from deprived areas and gave it to more rich, affluent ones, yeah, that's going to sink any argument Rishi Sunak or the Conservatives will put forward about levelling up. And I've said before, if I was Labour, I would be making sure that that video clip plays non-stop throughout the general election. Non-stop. And of course, that then gets on to about arguing from, the dispute after 5 years of doing it. When the Conservatives and Boris Johnson made at that same election in 2019, you have to give us a mandate so we can sort out this Brexit mess. They are going back to the public after 5 years with Boris Johnson going, let's get Brexit done. I got Brexit done. Hey, look, isn't that oven-ready Brexit deal fantastic? Look at it. It's all done and dusted. It makes them look completely foolish to go back to voters asking for more time or at least something else to try and sort of get Brexit done. And then the biggest revelation here, because I haven't seen this reported a lot, but I've looked into this, and this is apparently quite true, that a lot of young MPs, so a lot of these first-time MPs that got elected because of Boris Johnson, are not preparing to stand again at the next general election because they have looked to the polls and they are pretty much guaranteed to lose their seat. That is fascinating to see. But back to it. So, given the above, whoever the quote senior government figures were who sent out this very hair running into the Sunday Times, they were remarkably careless. That the figure of blame has now settled on Jeremy Hunt illustrates why it is historically unusual for an incoming Prime Minister not to choose their own Chancellor. It also suggests that, once again, of how little Sunak's incapable Brexiteer bona fides seem to actually now count among some sections of his party. As a new MP, first elected in 2015, he took a big risk in defying David Cameron to back Leave in the referendum. That he now should be viewed with such suspicion, even more than met Liz Truss, an actual Remainer, is therefore surprising. So, you may remember a couple of weeks ago, we talked about how Brexiteers were turning on each other and starting Brexit infighting. That now has seemed to happen on a more scale, even suspecting Rishi Sunak, who was a bona fide Brexiteer right from the start, is now treated with suspicion. It's more than surprising. It's absolutely incredible just how lack of function and there is really now in the Conservative Party. It's lost all complete coherency. It's unbelievable. But back to it. Then it isn't just idle talk of the Switzerland that is riling up the Brexiteers. There is also deep suspicion among the members of the European Research Group about the positive mood music ministers claim they can hear coming out from the negotiations over the Northern Ireland Protocol. Given that Brussels has shown no sign of reopening its negotiating mandate, and that Sunak is accepting the arbitrary deadlines from Joe Biden to get the whole thing sorted out, MPs are worried that ministers intend to fold on the government's red line about the role of the European Court of Justice in policing Ulster's relationship with the EU. And bear in mind, those red lines, right from the start, have caused trouble. But those red lines were set out to try and pacify the Brexiteers. And of course, every time the government has gone, well, okay, to get this really sorted out, we're going to have to come down and sort of, go pull back those red lines. That's when the Brexiteers have struck. And that's when they've done the most damage. That's what they did to Theresa May. So the very fact that now they are potentially seeing this, it's going to cause a lot of problems. It could cause a whole lot of problems. And I worry that we are going to get this potential solution to the Northern Ireland Protocol. And then as soon as it's announced, out come the Brexiteers, out come they striking and start causing a lot of trouble. Now, of course, who knows how much trouble they will still be able to make. That's for certain, but it's going to be some very, very much skullduggery going on in Westminster. I can tell you that now. But back to it. Steve Baker, whom one might have expected to be their man on the inside, seems to have interpreted his role as playing good cop in a double act without a bad cop. Combine all this with mounting unease about the political consequences of the autumn statement and the fact that MPs never really bought into anything that one might call Sunakism, it becomes easy to explain why the Prime Minister is so vulnerable to such fits of vapours from his backbenchers. Yeah, the cost of this infighting could be enormous. And this infighting is going to be absolutely enormous. This will, the more infighting that happens and the more we want this to happen, because they've shown no sign that they aren't going to sort of infight, that the next 2024 general election is going to be an absolute, wipeout potentially for them. But back to it. So it's going to be enormous because the 2024 general is a general election. The Conservatives and the Brexiteer ones in particular really need to win. They need to have the time to bed down our relationship with the EU and a whole parliament to drive forward with regulatory divergence. This is what they want, because Boris Johnson in his manifesto never focused on those. Hence why I think there is the whole the EU revocation reform bill is almost an acceptance, certainly put forward by Jacob Rees-Mogg and certainly by the Brexiteers as one. This could be our last chance to try and get rid of as many of these EU laws so that we can diverge as much as possible. And like I say, we're keeping an eye on this. It's already being amended to hell by the opposition. It will not pass in its certainly not pass in its original form, because even other Brexiteers have turned around and said, yeah, that bill is incredibly bad. So there is very, very little chance that that bill may actually pass in its original form. And even then, there could be even less likely amount of its passing, maybe even passing the House of Lords. So back to it. A new generation of Labour leadership would probably be much less keen to refight the old battles that Keir Starmer, a veteran commander of the Europhile rearguard action after 2017. I don't know. This new group, this new crop of Labour MPs that we would get may very well want to have that fight. One of the things that I think, again, sort of we talked about yesterday about how these Leads for Europe groups and things like that need to do. They need to start getting toeholds into local Labour parties and start getting involved in candidate selection and start making sure that they put pro-European, pro-EU MPs into those selection processes and getting them elected. That's certainly one thing that we need to look at. But back to it. They also might be less keen to outsource their constitutional thinking to Gordon Brown, whose proposals the Tories will almost universally detest. Like I say, we are expecting this report of this constitutional reform from Gordon Brown. We've already heard from Keir Starmer that he wants to get rid of the House of Lords and replace it with, an elected body. Now, it hasn't said how we're going to do that, but this is, again, something where the PR movement needs to step into. And so far, they haven't said anything, but they need to step into that area as well. Of it's not just the House of Commons we need to reform, but also the House of Lords as well. So that's something that we need to certainly drive home that message of. And I always do try to do that on this channel. That it's not just the House of Commons, it's the House of Lords we need to reform as well. So back to it. But should the Conservatives wake up after a Labour term in 2028 to a Britain that is now tied to the EU and a constitution that is more firmly entrenched against their vision for the country than ever, they will have nobody to blame but themselves. So obviously, as we said, this is, Henry Hill. He's the deputy editor of Conservative Home. And Conservative Home is, at the last Conservative party conference, they were the flagship sponsor. That is how influential Conservative Home is. So it is obvious to hear that at the end, he's like, we're really worried about Britain's going to be tied more to the EU in a more constitution that is more firmly against their vision for the country than ever. They are panicking, and the panic is spreading. The panic is spreading more and more. Not only now is it just in the parliamentary Tory party where there is now a big, serious panic, but there is now starting to spread even to the non-parliamentary party, because even the non-parliamentary party is just as fractious as the parliamentary party. We could be seeing, and he didn't mention it, but we could be seeing a complete and absolute breakup of the current modern Conservative Party. Ultimately, it will reform into something else. There will always be a sort of, Conservative Party, but it will break up and it will sort of reform into something else. But that breakup will be amazing, because just as I said a couple of weeks ago about how a Republican civil war in America is going to be great for lefties and progressives and Democrats in America, to certainly getting your agenda passed in the next 2 years, so is it going to be the same if our Conservative Party falls to absolute pieces and is unable to put forward any coherent opposition or plans, or even try to stymie any plans that the left and progressives in this country would want to put forward, being a big constitutional reform, sort of reforming our voting system for Westminster and, replacing the House of Lords, sort of tying sort of close relationships with the EU. It's coming. And I'll tell you now, I've often talked about how big this Tory civil war has been. And we have seen over the past couple of years since we've talked about it, the skirmishes that have gone on. And they have been skirmishes. It's never escalated to full-blown, civil war. But there have been skirmishes, there have been casualties, and the battle lines have been firmly drawn. I think the Tory party is a powder keg. And I think it will be losing the next general election, that sets them off. And once that touch paper is hit, there is no stopping that absolute explosion that is going to happen. So, as always, thank you very much for watching. Like I say, please do remember to hit that like, share, and subscribe button. And of course, down below, there are links to my Patreon page and a one-off link called Buy Me Coffee, where you can buy me coffee. As always, thank you very much to those people who do help and support the channel. Like I say, down below, there is the YouTube thank you button. And of course, there is the YouTube Patreon that you can join as well, called the Pony Club. Down below, and you can join as well. And as always, thank you very much, as always, and we'll see you all next time.